He didn't stumble. He didn't trip. He simply fell, and his head landed directly on the shoulder of the most feared CEO in the entire building. The room stopped breathing. Clara Vaughn, the woman who had made grown men hand in their resignations without blinking, sat perfectly still in her wheelchair, her jaw set, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Not one muscle moved. And that was the most terrifying part. Because everyone in that boardroom knew one thing. Clara Vaughn never let anything slide. But what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Not even Daniel. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now. You do not want to miss where this goes. Daniel Brooks had learned, somewhere between his daughter's third ear infection and his second consecutive all-nighter, that the human body could be lied to. You could tell it you weren't tired. You could splash cold water on your face, drink your fourth cup of black coffee before 7 a.m., and stand in front of a mirror reciting your own name just to make sure you were still tracking. You could do all of that, and for a while, just long enough to be dangerous, your body would believe you. But it always collected its debt. Always. And it was never gentle when it did. He'd had 4 hours of real sleep in the last 72. Not broken sleep, not nap sleep. 4 hours total, accumulated in 20-minute fragments across 3 nights, each one interrupted by a cough down the hall, a nightmare, a small voice calling "Daddy" in the dark, or simply his own mind refusing to shut down long enough to let him rest. His daughter, Lily, was 7 years old. She was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and, on weeks like this one, the reason he walked through the world looking like a man who'd been wrung out and hung up to dry. She'd been sick since Tuesday. Not dangerously sick, just sick enough to need him every 2 hours. Sick enough that she couldn't go to Mrs. Patterson next door. Sick enough that the school had called and he'd had to leave the Hargrove account presentation half-finished on his laptop while he drove 40 minutes round trip to pick her up. He'd sat with her through 2 nights of fever. He'd read The Very Hungry Caterpillar until he'd started mouthing the words before he turned the pages. He'd held her hair back, changed her sheets, filled and refilled her water glass, and told her 17 times that she was going to be fine. She was fine now. Fever broke Thursday morning. She was at school today. Which meant Daniel was here. 34th floor, Bond Capital Group. Glass walls, marble floors, and a boardroom table that probably cost more than his car. He stood near the back of the room, with his portfolio folder tucked under his arm, and his tie slightly crooked, because he hadn't noticed in the elevator, and nobody had told him since. There were 11 other people in the room. Senior executives, VP level, most of them in suits that fit better than his felt right now. The kind of people who slept 8 hours and had housekeepers and went to the gym at 6 in the morning because they wanted to, not because a crying child had woken them and they figured they might as well do something productive. He was not thinking clearly. He knew this. He had the self-awareness to know that the part of his brain responsible for sharp thinking was operating on fumes, which was itself a kind of cognitive irony. The only sharp thought he was capable of was recognizing that he wasn't capable of sharp thoughts. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The room smelled like fresh coffee, and expensive cologne, and something floral, probably from the centerpiece on the table, white orchids in a low glass vase. He'd noticed details like that lately. The exhausted brain, he'd read somewhere, fixated on irrelevant things. Anchor points. White orchids. Marble floor. 11 people. 1 empty chair at the head of the table. The chair was empty because Clara Vaughn was not in a chair. She was in a wheelchair. He hadn't met her in person before today. He'd heard about her. Everyone at Vaughn Capital had heard about Clara Vaughn long before they ever got close enough to see her face. She was 44 years old, a decade into running the company her father had built, and then, by most accounts, run into the ground before she'd quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony, taken control. She had a mechanical engineering degree from MIT, an MBA from Wharton, and a reputation so precise and so consistent that it had hardened over the years into something closer to mythology. People called her the surgeon, not as a compliment, as a warning. She didn't yell, she didn't throw things, she didn't make speeches or issue dramatic ultimatums. She simply identified what wasn't working and removed it. Contracts, departments, people. The methodology was always the same. No emotional escalation, no second chances, no hesitation. If you were underperforming, she told you once, just once. And if you were still underperforming after that, you were gone. And the conversation she'd already had with you was the only goodbye you were going to get. She'd been in the wheelchair for 11 years. A car accident, according to company records, though nobody at the company had ever been bold enough to ask about it directly. Spinal cord injury, partial paralysis from the waist down. It had not slowed her down in any observable way. If anything, people said, and these were people who were afraid of her, so take that for what it was. It had made her sharper. Like something had been stripped away, and what remained was nothing but precision. She rolled into the boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock. Not 9:01, not 8:59. 9 o'clock, as the digital display on the far wall clicked over. And Daniel watched her come through the door and felt something settle in the room. Not calm, but weight. The weight of attention. Everyone straightened slightly, the way people do when someone walks in who they are genuinely afraid of disappointing. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a fitted black shirt, her dark hair pulled back cleanly, her posture in the chair absolutely upright. She had the kind of face that had been striking once, and had now moved beyond striking into something colder and more controlled. Cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadow, a mouth set in a line that suggested it smiled rarely, and only for reasons it had vetted in advance. She didn't greet the room. She placed a single tablet on the table in front of her, looked at the screen briefly, and then looked up. "We're behind on Hargrove by 14 days, she said. "I want to understand why." That was it. No good morning. No acknowledgement of the 11 people who'd rearranged their schedules to be here. Just the problem, stated with the flatness of a medical diagnosis. The VP of Business Development, Marcus Webb, cleared his throat. He was a large man who somehow always managed to look small when Clara Vaughn was in the room. "We ran into some complications with the client's internal approval structure," he said. The procurement delay was documented in the risk assessment I reviewed in January. Clara didn't raise her voice. She just stated it, the way you'd state a mathematical fact. Which means the delay wasn't unexpected. What I'm asking is, what action was taken when it became clear the delay was going to affect our timeline? Not what caused the delay. What was done about it? Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. "Brooks." Clara's eyes moved across the room and found Daniel with an efficiency that suggested she'd known exactly where he was standing the whole time. "You're on Hargrove. Talk me through your end." Every head in the room turned toward him. He stepped forward, opened his portfolio folder, and found the page he needed on the second try. His hands were steadier than he'd expected. Some deep instinct had kicked in. The professional autopilot that takes over when the rest of you is running on empty. The part that remembers how to perform even when it can't quite manage to think. Client flagged 3 additional compliance checkpoints in the first week of March, he said. I escalated to Webb's office on the 9th, got confirmation that we'd absorb the delay internally and adjust the deliverable schedule. I updated the project file and sent a revised timeline to the client contact on the 12th. And the client confirmed receipt? Yes. Do you have that confirmation? It's in the file. He'd put it there himself 3 nights ago, during the 1 hour Lily had been deeply enough asleep that he'd been able to sit at the kitchen table with his laptop and actually concentrate. He'd known. Some small, exhausted, still functional part of him had known that there would be a moment exactly like this one. He'd prepared for it. He was grateful, distantly, for that version of himself. Send it to me. Clara made a note on her tablet. The revised timeline. Is it achievable? With current resources, yes. With the next scheduled review pushed back by 1 week, which the client has already agreed to in writing. There was a brief silence. Marcus Webb visibly exhaled. Fine. Clara moved on. Just like that. No commendation, no approval, no acknowledgement beyond the single word. She was already looking at the next item. And Daniel, who had just successfully navigated a direct interrogation from the most feared executive in the building on less sleep than a surgical resident, felt the adrenaline start to leave his body like air from a slow puncture. That was the problem with adrenaline. It was a loan, not a resource. And the moment the threat passed, it started calling in what it was owed. He stood against the wall and felt the room tilt very slightly, like a boat responding to a wave. Not now. He straightened his spine. Do not do this right now. He focused on the orchids, then on the marble floor, then on the words Clara was saying to the head of finance about Q2 projections, following the logic of it, tracking the argument, giving his brain something to grip. It worked for a few minutes. The meeting rolled on. Someone was presenting slides, numbers, graphs, trend lines in blue and red. Daniel watched the shapes move on the screen and felt something behind his eyes get very heavy, like a curtain being slowly drawn across a window. Don't. He blinked, hard, rolled his shoulders back, shifted his weight. The woman next to him, a VP he didn't know well, Teresa Langford, glanced at him sideways. He gave her the smallest nod. I'm fine. She looked away. He wasn't fine. He was 3 feet from Clara Vaughn's wheelchair, standing at the corner of the table nearest the door, and his body was shutting down with the quiet determination of a system that had been overridden too many times and had finally decided it was no longer accepting the user's input. He felt himself sway, just slightly, just enough. And then, in the space between 1 second and the next, between I should step back and I need to sit down, his eyes closed, his knees softened, and his head dropped. It landed on Clara Vaughn's shoulder. The sound that went through the room was not a gasp. It was more like the absolute cessation of sound. 11 people collectively holding their breath. Every ambient noise in the room swallowed by the sudden, total, catastrophic silence of a moment that nobody knew how to process. Daniel's head rested on her shoulder. Heavy, warm, completely still. Clara Vaughn froze. The tablet in her hands did not move. Her posture did not change. The line of her jaw did not shift. She sat there, upright, perfectly composed, and for 3 seconds, long seconds, seconds that Daniel would later be unable to reconstruct because he wasn't conscious for them. Nobody in that room moved, or spoke, or breathed. Teresa Langford's hand moved halfway toward Daniel's arm, instinctively, and then stopped. Marcus Webb's mouth opened. The finance head, mid-sentence, simply stopped talking. And Clara did not move. She sat still, and her left hand, the one closest to Daniel, lifted slowly from the armrest of her wheelchair. Not to push him away, not to summon security. Her fingers found the sleeve of his jacket, very gently, and held there. Just held. Steadying. Daniel came back to himself in pieces. First, the pressure of something firm against his cheek. Then, warmth. Then, the sound of his own breathing, too slow, too deep, wrong for a boardroom. Then, the smell of something clean and faint. Not perfume exactly, more like soap, something unadorned. And the realization, surfacing through the water of unconsciousness like a message in a bottle, that he was leaning on a person, that he was leaning on her. He came upright so fast he nearly overbalanced the other way. His hand shot out and caught the edge of the table. His portfolio folder hit the floor. He was awake and standing and hot with a mortification so pure it was almost physical. A full-body flush of horror that started at the base of his skull and spread in every direction at once. "I'm sorry." The words came out before he'd finished forming them. "I'm so sorry. I apologize. I didn't—" "Sit down." Clara's voice was level, not cold, not warm, just even, like a surface that had been carefully planed flat. He stared at her. "Mr. Brooks." She said his name with the same precision she said everything. "Sit down." He looked around the table. 11 faces, ranging from stunned to carefully neutral to something that might, in another context, have been compassion. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was moving. The entire room was waiting for the event that should have already happened. The removal, the reprimand, the cold and surgical dismissal that Clara Vaughn was known for, that everyone in this room had personally witnessed at least once. It was not coming. Clara gestured to the chair nearest Daniel, the one at the foot of the table, without drama, without impatience. The gesture said, "Sit, and do it now, and do not make more of this than it needs to be." He sat. He did not trust his legs anyway. Clara looked at her tablet, then looked at him again, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, for the first time since he'd ever been in proximity to this woman, if he was being honest, he felt her looking at him rather than at his performance. There was a quality to it that he couldn't name. It wasn't soft. Clara Vaughn didn't do soft. But it was present, specific. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than it had been for the rest of the meeting. Not dramatically quieter, just enough that it was clearly for him and not for the room. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. 4 hours, he said. In 3 days. He watched something move across her face. Not pity, he would have flinched from pity. Something more considered than that. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed everything, calmly and without comment. And then she looked at the room. "We'll break for 15 minutes, she said. "Marcus, have someone pull the Hargrove confirmation from Brooks's file and send it to me directly. Teresa, the Q2 slides can wait until Thursday." She looked back at Daniel. "You're done for today. Ms. Vaughn, the presentation is covered." She cut him off without sharpness, just finality. "I read your revised timeline. I read the confirmation. There is nothing you need to present today that isn't already in writing." He looked at her. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe some flicker of contempt beneath the professionalism, the private judgment that she was too controlled to ever let into her expression. He looked, because some part of him needed to know if he was being managed or if he was being seen, and he could not yet tell the difference. What he found was neither, or maybe both. "Go home," Clara Vaughn said. And then, so quietly that he wasn't sure anyone else in the room could hear it. Sleep. It was not a gentle statement. It was a directive, delivered the way all of her directives were delivered, with the assumption that it would be followed, and without the softness that would have made it feel like charity. But there was something in the way she said it, a weight, a specificity, as though the word sleep meant something to her that it might not mean to anyone else in the room, that hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He picked up his portfolio folder from the floor. He stood, steadied himself, nodded once in Clara's direction without trusting himself to make further eye contact. He walked out of the boardroom. The door closed behind him. He stood in the corridor, and the fluorescent lights buzzed above him, and his hands were shaking. Not from fear, not exactly. He'd just done something that, by every professional rule he understood, should have ended his career in this building. He'd fallen asleep in a meeting. He'd fallen asleep on his CEO. He'd given every person in that room a story they would be telling for years. You'll never believe what happened to this guy. And he'd done it in front of the one woman in the building whose approval mattered most and was least given. And she had told him to go home. She had steadied him. She had let him rest. For 3 seconds in front of 11 witnesses, Clara Vaughn had held his sleeve and not moved, and in doing so had done something so far outside the parameters of who she was supposed to be that Daniel was still trying to process it as he walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. Behind him, through the glass walls of the boardroom, he could see, without turning around, that the meeting had resumed. Slides were on the screen. Marcus Webb was talking. Clara was at the head of the table, tablet in hand, back straight, every inch the surgeon. But her eyes, for just a moment, cut toward the glass. He didn't know if she saw him. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Daniel Brooks leaned against the back wall of the elevator, looked at the ceiling, and felt the first real breath he'd taken in 3 days leave his body in a long, ragged exhale. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Mrs. Patterson. Lily called from school. Said to tell you she ate all her lunch. Thought you'd want to know. He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, and this time, in the quiet metal box descending 34 floors, he let them stay closed. He slept for 14 hours. Not the fractured, half-conscious kind of sleep he'd been stealing in 20-minute pieces all week. Real sleep. The deep and dreamless kind that pulled him under so completely that when he finally surfaced, he didn't know, for a disoriented moment, what day it was, or whether it was morning or evening or something in between. The bedroom was dark. Lily's backpack was on the floor by the door, which meant someone had brought her home from school. Mrs. Patterson, probably. He'd texted her from the car, barely coherent, and she'd responded with, "Go sleep, I'll get her," and 3 words that had nearly undone him in the parking garage. "You need this." He lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let himself be still. His phone was face down on the nightstand. He didn't reach for it immediately. He gave himself 60 seconds. Just 60, he wasn't reckless. To exist in the quiet before the world's demands reassembled themselves and started knocking. When he finally turned it over, he had 23 notifications. 11 emails, 4 Slack messages, 2 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, 1 voicemail, a text from his sister in Phoenix asking if he was still alive, and 1 email, sitting at the top of the list, time-stamped 2:47 p.m., from an address he didn't have saved but recognized immediately from the domain, that made him sit up so fast his head swam. The sender name read, C. Vaughn. He sat there in the dark with his phone in his hand and did not open it for a full 30 seconds. He was not afraid of many things. He'd buried his wife 3 years ago, and raised a daughter alone since she was 4, and handled every nightmare, every school conference, every broken furnace and overdue invoice and performance review without someone to debrief with afterward. He had a specific and hard-earned relationship with fear. He knew it. He respected it. He moved through it. But sitting in the dark, staring at that name on his phone screen, he felt something close to what he imagined a man felt when he opened a letter from the IRS. The particular dread of consequences that have already been set in motion and are now simply arriving. He opened it. Mr. Brooks, HR will be in contact Monday morning regarding a schedule adjustment. Consider this a standing directive. If your circumstances require accommodation, you are to make that known to your direct supervisor, rather than arriving to a quarterly review on 3 days without sleep. This is not a reprimand. It is a requirement. C. Vaughn. He read it twice, then a third time. It was not what he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected. A formal write-up, maybe? Or the polished corporate language of a performance improvement plan. Something that would force him to sit across from HR with a folder of documentation that began with the phrase, "On the morning of March 14th. He'd spent part of the drive home constructing that scenario in his head, running the logic of it, how he'd explain, what he'd say, whether any explanation was adequate for falling asleep on the CEO's shoulder during a quarterly review. Instead, he had this. 4 sentences. No warmth, but no cold either. Just clarity. The same precision she applied to everything, but pointed somewhere he hadn't expected. At him. At the fact that he was struggling and had not said so. He put the phone down and sat with that for a while. Lily found him 20 minutes later, still sitting on the edge of the bed in yesterday's dress shirt, looking at the middle distance. "Daddy?" She appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair loose from whatever braid Mrs. Patterson had put it in that morning. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, Bug." He held out an arm. She crossed the room and climbed up beside him with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has never doubted she was welcome. "I'm okay. I just slept." "Mrs. Patterson said you were very tired." Mrs. Patterson was right. "She made us grilled cheese." Lily settled against his side. "She burned mine a little, but I didn't tell her." "That was considerate." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you in trouble at work?" He looked at her. She was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and his stubborn jaw, and she was watching him with a directness that still caught him off guard sometimes, the way children hadn't yet learned to look away from things that might be uncomfortable. "No," he said, and then, because she would know if he was performing, "I don't think so. Something happened today, and I'm still figuring out what it means." "Something bad?" "Something unexpected." He kissed the top of her head. "Different from bad." She considered this. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone filing the information away for later review. And then, "Can we have cereal for dinner? Mrs. Patterson's grilled cheese was a little too burned." He laughed. It came out of him before he'd decided to do it. Real and tired and unexpectedly full. "Yeah," he said. "We can have cereal." The weekend passed the way weekends passed when you'd been running on empty for too long, and finally stopped. Slowly, loosely, without the rigid shape of a schedule holding it together. He took Lily to the park Saturday morning. He called his sister back and spent 40 minutes letting her talk, which was what she needed, and, he realized midway through, what he needed too. He went to bed at 9 o'clock Saturday night and slept until 7, and woke up feeling like someone had put him back together with marginally better parts. Sunday, he wrote Clara Vaughn a reply. He drafted it 4 times. The first was too formal. stiff with professional distance, the kind of language that put walls up instead of bridges. The second was too personal, veering into territory that felt inappropriate for a CEO he'd met once. The third was fine, technically, but read like a legal document, and he deleted it because it felt dishonest. The fourth one he sent. Ms. Vaughn, thank you for your message and for your response on Friday. I understand the directive and I'll act on it. I also want to say, and I recognize this may be outside the scope of the conversation you intended, that what happened on Friday was more than exhaustion. It's been a difficult stretch. I appreciate what you did, and I don't say that lightly. D. Brooks. He hit send before he could draft a fifth version. He didn't expect a response. Or rather, he expected the same silence that had defined his professional relationship with Clara Vaughn up to this point, which was the silence of someone who existed at a level above his, where direct correspondence wasn't routine and didn't need to be. Her reply came 40 minutes later. I know it has been. HR. Monday at 9. Don't be late. He stared at the message. I know it has been. 4 words, sitting there with the same flatness as everything else she wrote, except they weren't flat at all. They were specific. She knew. Knew what, exactly? His exhaustion? His situation? How much did Clara Vaughn know about the life of a mid-level executive she'd spoken to, at length, exactly once? He filed it away. Showed up Monday at 8:58. The HR meeting was efficient and, for an HR meeting, almost shockingly practical. His direct supervisor, Webb, wasn't there. Instead, he sat across from a woman named Patricia Osei from People Operations, who had a warm handshake and a folder that was already open when he walked in. We're formalizing a flexible scheduling arrangement, Patricia said, without preamble. 2 days remote per week, standing approval. For any calendar week where your daughter has a medical appointment or school closure, you have pre-authorized half-day flexibility. Just flag it in the system 48 hours ahead where possible. The Hargrove account deliverables stay on track. Everything else adjusts around your output, not your hours. She looked up. Questions? Daniel looked at the folder. He could see, across the top of the first page, the internal approval signature. It wasn't Webb's. It wasn't HR director's. It was a 2-letter initial in the authorization field, neat and angular, that he recognized immediately. No, he said. No questions. He meant it. He had exactly 0 questions. What he had was a feeling he couldn't immediately categorize, something between gratitude and discomfort, the specific unease of receiving something significant from someone you don't yet know how to owe a debt to. He was back at his desk by 10. He had 3 emails, a revised Hargrove document to review, and a Slack message from a colleague named James, who had been in the boardroom Friday and had sent, with characteristic brevity, "You okay, man?" Daniel typed back, "Yeah. Weirdly, yeah." He meant that, too. He didn't see Clara Vaughn for the rest of that week, which was normal. She occupied the 34th floor the way a weather system occupied a region, present and influential, without being visible at every moment. He heard about her. He heard about the restructuring of the West Coast client team, which he'd apparently finalized in a 2-hour meeting on Tuesday. He heard about the vendor contract that had been quietly terminated Wednesday afternoon. He heard about Marcus Webb's suddenly scheduled performance conversation on Thursday, the outcome of which nobody in the office knew, but several people speculated about in the kitchen with lowered voices. The office had a rhythm when Clara was in the building. People walked a little faster, laughed a little more quietly, worded their emails a little more carefully. It wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear. It was something more like altitude sickness. The air was thinner up there, and everyone felt it. What Daniel noticed that week was that he no longer felt it the same way he had before Friday. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He found out 2 weeks later when his phone rang at 6:15 in the evening. He was standing in the kitchen helping Lily with her spelling homework, which was a loose interpretation of helping. Mostly, he spelled the word aloud, and she wrote it down, and then argued with him about whether she'd written it correctly. And he answered without looking at the screen, assuming it was Mrs. Patterson, or his sister, or someone from Lily's school. "Brooks." Clara's voice was unmistakable. No greeting, no preamble. He went very still. "Ms. Vaughn." "I'm reviewing the Hargrove final deliverable. You sent it this afternoon." Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes." "The compliance summary in Section 4. You added language that wasn't in the original brief." He put down the pencil. "I did." "Why?" It wasn't phrased as a question exactly, but it wanted an answer. He leaned against the counter, gathering his thoughts. Lily looked up at him, reading the shift in his posture with the precise social radar of a 7-year-old who had learned to pay attention. "The client's procurement team flagged a new regulatory guideline on Thursday," he said. "It wasn't in the original scope, but it will affect their Q3 filing. I couldn't send them a compliance summary that didn't address it. Technically, it was outside the brief. Practically, leaving it out would have meant they got bad advice." He paused. "I'll note it as an out-of-scope addition and absorb the hours internally, if that's the concern." A silence. The specific kind of silence that Clara Vaughn produced. Not empty, but weighted. The silence of someone processing rather than pausing. "It's not the concern," she said. Then, "It was the right call." She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without the upward inflection that would have made it a compliment. Just factual. True. "I'm noting it in the project file." He blinked. "Okay." Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, "How is your daughter?" The question was so far outside anything he'd expected from this phone call that for a moment he genuinely thought he'd misheard. "She's..." He looked at Lily, who had abandoned the spelling list and was now drawing something in the margin of her worksheet with absolute concentration. "She's good. Healthy. Thank you for asking." "Good." A pause. Then, with the same flat precision she gave every other sentence. "It matters. Her being healthy. You should know that it matters. To the work. When the people doing the work are..." She stopped. It was the first time he'd ever heard her stop in the middle of a sentence. As though she'd arrived somewhere she hadn't intended to go. "The HR policy stands," she said, pivoting smoothly. "I've asked Patricia to flag it to the full executive team this quarter. It'll be standard company practice by July." "For caregivers specifically?" "For anyone with responsibilities that don't stop when the workday does." She said it with an edge that wasn't directed at him. Something more private than that. More internal. Which, in my experience, is everyone. He turned that over carefully. "I think a lot of people will be grateful," he said, "including ones who would never say so out loud." "I know." No irony. Just the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need to be thanked to know the value of what they've done. "Ms. Vaughn." He wasn't sure what he was going to say until he started saying it. "Can I ask you something?" A beat. "You can try." Friday, in the meeting. He kept his voice even, measured. "You could have had me removed. You could have made an example. Everyone in that room was waiting for it. I knew they were waiting for it. But you didn't." He looked at the ceiling. "Why?" The silence this time was longer. Lily had looked up from her drawing. He turned slightly away, lowering his voice. "Because," Clara said finally, "you had already held it together longer than you should have had to. And I've spent enough years watching people hold things together alone To know that the only thing that actually makes it worse is punishing someone for the moment they can't anymore. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what she'd said landed in a way that required a moment. It wasn't soft. It wasn't delivered with warmth or sentiment. It was stated the way she stated everything, as fact, as something she'd worked out and had no reason to soften. But the thing it described was not cold at all. "I appreciate that," he said quietly.
"Don't be late to the Hargrove review Thursday," she said, and she was already back to herself. Or back to the version of herself the world got to see. 9 o'clock. I'll be there at 8:58. There was a pause that he thought, for just a moment, contained something that might, in someone less composed than Clara Vaughan, have been the beginning of a smile. "Good," she said, and the line went dead. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the phone in his hand. "Daddy," Lily's voice, patient, from the table. "What does necessary spell?" He looked at his daughter. He looked at her worksheet, the spelling list, the small, careful drawing she'd made in the margin. A house with 4 windows and a sun in the corner, the way children always drew suns. Half circle rising from the edge of the page, like something just beginning. "Necessary," he said. He pulled out the chair and sat back down. 2 C's, 2 S's. People get those mixed up. "That's silly," Lily said, writing it. "Yeah." He watched her write. "It is." He didn't tell her about the phone call. She was 7, and it would have meant nothing to her, and he was still figuring out what it meant to him. But something had shifted, quietly, without announcement, the way the most significant shifts always happened. Not in the boardroom, not in the HR meeting, not even in the 14 hours of sleep that had reset some fundamental part of him. But here, in a kitchen, 6:15 on a Tuesday, spelling necessary for a 7-year-old who was drawing a house with a sun coming up. The line between professional and something more complicated had moved. He didn't know yet where it had moved to. He only knew that it had, and that somewhere on the 34th floor, in an office with glass walls and a view of the whole city, there was a woman who knew it too. The Hargrove review on Thursday went cleanly. Daniel arrived at 8:58, as promised, and Clara noted it the same way she noted everything, without comment, but with the particular alertness of someone who tracks whether people do what they say they're going to do. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. She asked 4 questions, 2 of which were directed at him, and both of which he answered without hesitation. When it ended, she closed her tablet and said, "Good work," in the direction of the table, not specifically at him, not specifically at anyone else, and wheeled out before the room had fully processed that the meeting was over. But she looked at him once, briefly, on her way to the door. Just once. The kind of look that doesn't carry a message so much as an acknowledgement. I see you. You see me. We both know where we stand. And then she was gone. And Marcus Webb was already talking about next steps, and Daniel was writing notes in his folder like the look hadn't happened. It had happened. He kept that to himself and stayed focused, which was easier now that he was actually sleeping. The flexible schedule had changed things in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Not the big things, not the core difficulty of being a single father, working a demanding job in a demanding company, but the small, accumulated weight of it. He could now take Lily to school on Tuesday and Thursday mornings without sprinting back to make a 9 o'clock. He could attend her spring concert without requesting time off and watching Webb's expressions cycle through the particular sequence of understanding and reluctant accommodation that he'd grown to dread. He could, on the days where everything went sideways, sick kid, missed bus, broken zipper on the school uniform at 7:45 a.m., absorb the chaos
without the additional panic of knowing he was about to fail at everything simultaneously. It didn't make the job easier. It made it survivable, which was different and, for right now, enough. He told his sister about it on the phone one evening while Lily was in the bath. His sister Rachel, who lived in Phoenix and called twice a week and never pretended not to worry about him, was quiet for a moment after he explained the policy change. "This CEO," Rachel said carefully. "She just decided to do this? After you fell asleep on her?" "It's company-wide," he said. "It's not... She didn't do it for me specifically." "Daniel," Rachel's voice had the particular tone she used when she was calling something exactly what it was. "She did it after what happened with you. That's not coincidence. That's causation. You don't know that." "I know you," Rachel said. "And I know that you're telling me this story the same way you told me about Sarah when you first met her. Like you're trying to find the version of it that sounds most like nothing is happening." He said nothing. Outside the bathroom door, he could hear the specific sound of Lily narrating an elaborate drama involving 2 rubber ducks and what appeared to be a plastic dinosaur. "It's not like that," he said finally. "I didn't say what it was like," Rachel said. "I just said something is happening." A pause. Is she good to you? At work?" He thought about it, really considered the question, turned it over, tried to answer it honestly. "She's fair," he said. "She's exacting, and she doesn't waste words, and she will absolutely take you apart if you're not doing the job. But she's fair." Another pause. "She sees things." "What kind of things?" "The kind most people miss because they're not paying close enough attention." He stopped himself there. "It's work, Rach. I just wanted to tell you about the schedule thing." "Of course," Rachel said, in a tone that meant she was absolutely filing everything he'd just said for future reference. He changed the subject, but he stayed with the conversation afterward, the way you stay with something that names what you've been quietly avoiding naming. The next 4 weeks moved at the pace that April moves when you've stopped fighting it. Faster than you expect, fuller than you plan for. Daniel closed the Hargrove account. He was assigned a new client, a mid-sized logistics firm out of Atlanta, which required 2 trips he scheduled carefully around Lily's calendar and Mrs. Patterson's availability. He got a passing commendation in the monthly team email, not from Clara, who didn't write those, but from Webb, who was apparently making a visible effort to rehabilitate his relationship with his team following whatever Thursday conversation with Clara had actually involved. He started running again. Not seriously, not training for anything. Just 30 minutes in the morning, 3 times a week, before Lily was awake. It was the kind of thing he'd let go after Sarah died, and had kept meaning to return to. The way you keep meaning to return to the habits that made you feel like yourself. He'd needed the sleep debt cleared first. He'd needed the breathing room. Now he had just enough of both to remember that his body was a thing he lived in, and not just a vehicle for getting through the day. He was 2 weeks into this when Clara Vaughn appeared at his office door on a Thursday afternoon. Not her assistant, not an email. Her. He was alone in his office, a glass-walled space on the 28th floor, small but private, which he'd arranged to face the window for exactly the reason that it gave him warning when people were approaching. He saw her coming down the corridor in his peripheral vision, and had exactly 3 seconds to not react visibly before she knocked once on the open door. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. In his professional experience, when senior executives asked if you had a few minutes, the correct answer was yes, regardless of whether you actually did. But the way Clara asked it, with the slight, almost imperceptible quality of something that was genuinely a question rather than a courtesy, made him answer it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Come in." She wheeled in and positioned herself across from his desk, with the same efficient self-sufficiency she brought to every physical space she occupied. He'd noticed early on that she never waited for people to figure out how to accommodate her wheelchair. She simply moved through rooms the way she moved through everything, directly and without making it a production. He'd adjusted to it quickly and had stopped noticing it, except in the moments where he noticed it with something like admiration for the economy of it. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly. Not the way you think I want you to answer." "Okay." "The Atlanta account. Mercer Logistics." She looked at him squarely. "How do you read them?" He considered. "They present as stable, but the internal communication structure is fragmented. The VP I've been dealing with and the CFO are not aligned. I'm getting different signals from each of them about what success looks like on this engagement. They're not going to tell us that directly. They don't know how." He paused. "I think there's a problem at the leadership level, that they're hoping a good external engagement will paper over." Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture, a very small, very precise shift, told him he'd said something worth saying. "What are you doing about it?" "I've been documenting the discrepancies between what each of them has told me, building a picture of where the gaps actually are. I was going to ask for a strategy session before our next client meeting to lay it out." He hesitated. "I was going to request it through web." "Come to me instead," Clara said. "Monday morning, 8 o'clock. He held that. "All right." She didn't move to leave, which was unusual. Clara Vaughn's meetings had a very specific quality of ending when they were over. No trailing off, no lingering. But she sat across from his desk, with her hands in her lap, and looked at him with the focused attention he'd come to recognize as her version of openness. Not warmth exactly, but presence. "You've been doing good work," she said. "Since the Hargrove review. Since before, even. But I'm telling you now because I should have said it sooner." He recognized the effort in that, not the words themselves. Clara saying something was good work was not a small thing. But he'd started to develop a sense of her metrics and knew he'd earned it. What he recognized was the telling of it. The decision to walk down 6 floors and say it in person, rather than leave it in an email or a performance note, or the silence that most people who worked for Clara simply learned to interpret as acceptance. "Thank you," he said. "That means something to me." "I know it does." Not self-congratulatory, just aware. She had an unusual quality of knowing exactly how her words landed, without needing to be told. "You don't hear it enough. People like you don't." He studied her. "People like me?" "People who do the work, without making sure everyone around them notices they're doing it." She looked at his desk briefly. The files, the logistics folders, the framed photo of Lily in the corner that had been there since his first week in this office. People who are holding more weight than what's in their job description, and don't expect to be accommodated for it. I think most parents with kids are doing some version of that. "Yes," she said. "And most companies treat it as a personal problem, rather than a structural one." She said it flatly, without editorializing, but the flatness itself was editorial. That was a failure on my part, for longer than it should have been. He didn't agree out loud. He didn't argue either. He let it sit, because she'd clearly needed to say it, and clearly hadn't done so lightly. And adding commentary either way would have been the wrong response. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She gave him the same answer she'd given on the phone. "You can try." "Why do you come down here yourself? You could send any of this by email. The Atlanta question, the commendation, any of it." She was quiet for a moment, not defensive, considering. "Because I spent a long time using efficiency as a reason to avoid rooms," she said. "Email is efficient. Keeping everything at a remove is efficient." She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "My father ran this company for 20 years, and I don't think he ever once had a conversation with a person on this floor that wasn't about a deliverable. He thought that was professionalism. A pause. I used to agree with him. What changed? She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the boardroom. Not at his performance, but at him. A lot of things, she said. Over a long time. She didn't elaborate, but there was something in the way she closed the sentence that told him it wasn't a door she was refusing to open, so much as one she'd only recently started finding her way back to herself. He nodded slowly. He understood something about that. The long road back to something you'd locked up, because the cost of keeping it accessible was more than you could manage. He'd done it with music after Sarah died. He'd done it with the idea of trusting people for a while. You padlocked things not because you wanted to lose them, but because you couldn't afford to bleed. For what it's worth, he said carefully, the people on this floor, they notice the difference, more than you might think. Clara looked at him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't entirely classify. Not surprised exactly. More like something that had been carefully held at arm's length was being acknowledged in spite of that. Monday, she said, 8 o'clock. I'll be there. She turned and wheeled toward the door, and then stopped in the doorway, turned back, which she did so rarely in any context that it always registered. Her eyes went to the framed photo of Lily. How old is she now? Clara asked. 7. He glanced at the photo himself. She'll be 8 in June. What does she want for her birthday? He laughed, a short, genuine sound. A dog. She's been lobbying for a dog since September. She's made a PowerPoint presentation about the benefits of dog ownership. She included a slide titled, Why Daddy is Wrong. Something happened to Clara Vaughn's face. It was brief and well-controlled, and he almost missed it. But he was paying attention now. He'd learned to pay attention. And what he saw was real. A softening at the corners of her mouth. The specific kind that comes not from amusement exactly, but from recognition. From having heard something that lands inside a feeling you forgot you had. She's going to be formidable, Clara said. She really is, Daniel said. It terrifies me on a daily basis. Clara looked at the photo for one more second. Then she was gone, and the corridor was empty, and Daniel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and let the quiet of the room settle around him. He was thinking about what Rachel had said. You're telling me this story the same way you told me about Sarah when you first met her. He was thinking about the specific look on Clara's face when she'd seen the photo of Lily. He was thinking about the phrase a long time, using efficiency as a reason to avoid rooms, and what it cost someone to say that out loud, and what it meant that she'd said it here, to him, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when she could have been anywhere else in the building. He didn't let himself follow the thought all the way to its end. Not yet. There was work to do, a strategy session to prepare for, a 7-year-old who needed to be picked up in 40 minutes, and who was, this week, working on a second draft of her dog PowerPoint that apparently now included a financial projection. But the thought was there, patient and quiet, and not going anywhere. He closed the Atlanta folder, picked up his keys, and headed for the elevator. The 34th floor was 3 levels above where he'd started. He'd been climbing toward it, he realized, for longer than he'd been aware of. And somewhere up there, behind glass walls and a view of the whole city, so had she. The Monday morning strategy session started at 8 o'clock and ran until 10:15. Daniel had prepared for 90 minutes of material. He'd built a tight, well-sourced presentation on the Mercer Logistics communication breakdown. The VP versus CFO misalignment. The gap between stated objectives and actual internal priorities. The 3 specific pressure points he'd identified that would derail the engagement if nobody addressed them directly. He'd done this the way he did everything work-related now, in the early morning hours before Lily was awake, at the kitchen table with coffee, and the particular focused quiet of a house not yet in motion. He laid it out in front of Clara without preamble, and let the work speak first. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without the small performative signals that most people use to demonstrate they were following along. No nodding, no no leaning forward. Just stillness and absolute attention, her eyes moving between his face and the documents on the table, and the quality of silence that told him he had her full weight behind him. When he finished, she asked 6 questions. Each one went deeper than the last, not to challenge what he'd found, but to excavate it, to find the load-bearing walls inside the analysis and test their strength. By the 4th question, he'd stopped referencing his notes entirely. By the 6th, they were both leaning over the table, talking about the Mercer CFO's particular brand of institutional defensiveness, the way surgeons might discuss a procedure they were in the middle of. Fast, specific, no words wasted. "You're right that they're hoping to paper over it," Clara said. "But the reason they brought us in isn't nothing. Somewhere in that leadership team, there's at least one person who knows what the real problem is and doesn't have the standing to say it." She tapped the table. "Find that person." "I think it's the operations director," Daniel said. "She's been in every meeting, says almost nothing, but every time the VP oversimplifies something, she writes a note. Not on a tablet, by hand." Clara looked at him. "You noticed that?" "It's a tell," he said. "When someone's writing by hand in a meeting full of tablets, they don't want their notes visible. She's documenting something she doesn't trust to the company system." He paused. "I'd like to find a reason to talk to her outside the formal meeting structure." "Do it," Clara said. "And when you do, don't lead with the engagement. Lead with her." She said it simply, without elaboration, the way she said things that she considered self-evident. People tell you the real thing when they believe you're actually asking about them and not the problem they're attached to. He looked at her. "Is that something you learned, or something you always knew?" She considered the question without deflecting it, which she'd come to understand was one of her specific qualities. She took questions seriously, turned them over, gave them the weight they deserved before answering. "Learned," she said. "The hard way, which is the only way it sticks." He didn't ask what the hard way had looked like. He didn't need to. He was beginning to understand that Clara Vaughn's harder lessons were written into the architecture of how she moved through the world, not in what she said about herself, but in what she'd built out of what had been done to her. The precision, the distance, the efficiency deployed like a defensive structure. He recognized it. He'd built versions of it himself. The session ended, and she rolled toward the door and paused, which he now understood was simply part of her rhythm. The pause in the doorway, the momentary recalibration before the next thing. "You're good at this," she said. Not the work specifically, just this. The conversation maybe. The way they'd just spent 2 hours inside a problem together and come out the other side with something sharper than either of them had brought in. "So are you," he said. She looked at him for just a moment, with an expression that walked the precise line between professional and personal, between the Clara Vaughn the building knew and whoever existed in the space beneath that. And then she was gone. He stood in the conference room alone for a moment before gathering his papers. Find that person. She'd said it about the Mercer operations director, but it landed somewhere else entirely. He picked up his folder and decided not to examine that too carefully. Not right now. And went back to work. He found the operations director. Her name was Vonda Marsh. 22 years with the company. The kind of institutional knowledge that accumulates in a person the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river. 2 weeks later. He engineered a reason to call her directly about a logistics data point, kept the conversation factual for 10 minutes, and then asked her a question that had nothing to do with the data point. What does success actually look like for your team at the end of this engagement? Not the deliverable, for your team. There was a silence on the line. Then Vonda Marsh said, "Nobody's asked me that," in a tone that was not accusatory, but simply truthful. And then she talked for 40 minutes. Daniel took 12 pages of notes and called Clara before he'd even left the parking garage. She picked up on the second ring. "Mercer? The problem isn't the communication structure," he said. "The problem is that the VP has been promising the board a digital transformation timeline that operations physically cannot deliver in 18 months. Vonda knows it. The CFO suspects it. Nobody has said it out loud because the VP is the founder's nephew, and the culture of that company has 22 years of not saying things out loud baked into it." A silence. "How confident are you?" "Confident enough to put it in writing." "Do that." A pause. "Tonight, if you can." "Lily has a spelling test tomorrow. I'll have it to you by 10. Another pause, shorter this time. "How's she doing? With the spelling?" He smiled despite himself, standing alone in a parking garage in Atlanta. "She misspelled necessary 3 times last night, and then accused the word of being poorly designed." A sound on Clara's end of the line. Small, brief, unmistakably real. Not quite a laugh. More like a laugh that had made it halfway out before being recalled on instinct. But he heard it. He cataloged it carefully. "I'll look for the memo by 10, she said, and the line went quiet. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the silence where her voice had been. He drove to the airport. He flew home. He helped Lily with her spelling test, got her to bed, and had the Mercer memo in Clara's inbox by 9:47. Her response came at 11:02 p.m. "Good. We'll talk tomorrow." He should have gone to sleep. He sat with his phone for a few minutes longer than he should have, aware of the particular quality of that awareness. The waiting for something that wasn't coming. The presence of a person in your thoughts at a time of night when only the people who matter to you tend to occupy that space. He put the phone down. He went to sleep. He did not, for the record, stop thinking about it. The next several weeks had a different texture than the ones that had come before. Something had shifted in the geography of his and Clara's professional relationship. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to anyone watching from the outside, but in the accumulative way that significant things shift, 1 degree at a time, until the compass reads somewhere entirely different than where it started. She called him directly now, without routing through web or through the formal escalation structure. He'd begun to understand that this was unusual. He'd had a candid conversation with Teresa Langford over coffee one afternoon, and Teresa, who had been at Vaughn Capital for 7 years, had said with characteristic directness, "She doesn't call people directly. She sends Krista, or she emails, or she summons you upstairs. I have never in 7 years seen Clara Vaughn dial someone's cell phone." Teresa had looked at him over her coffee cup. "Just so you know." He'd said, "Good to know," in a neutral tone, and Teresa had smiled the smile of someone who was not remotely fooled. The Monday morning strategy sessions had become a standing appointment, not formally scheduled, not listed on any calendar, but consistent enough that he began preparing for them the way he prepared for the Hargrove review. Seriously, specifically, with the awareness that Clara would ask the question he hadn't fully answered yet, and that the most useful thing he could do was find it first. She was different in those sessions than she was in any other room he'd seen her occupy. Not softer, not less precise, but less armored. There were moments, usually in the second hour, when the problem they were working through had demanded enough of both of them that the performative layer had worn down, where she said things that revealed the edges of herself. Not confessional things. Clara wasn't confessional, he was learning. But specific things. The particular kind of specific that tells you more about a person than they're intending to share. One morning, she said, offhandedly, while reviewing the revised Mercer timeline, "My father told me once that the reason he didn't promote women to senior positions was that they'd eventually have children and their focus would divide." She said it with the same flat affect she gave everything, not looking up from the document. "I spent 10 years trying to prove him wrong by making sure nothing about my focus ever divided. And it worked, if your definition of working is a very efficient kind of alone." He looked at her. She was still looking at the document. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I regret the years I spent thinking efficiency was the same thing as strength." She turned a page. "I don't regret being here. I just think I could have been here without leaving so many rooms empty." He understood that. He understood it with a specific comprehension of someone who had also, in his own way, believed for a time that if he just kept moving fast enough and doing enough and holding enough together, the absence at the center of things would eventually stop mattering. It didn't work that way. It never worked that way. The empty rooms stayed empty. You just got better at not walking into them. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're better at being in rooms now than you're giving yourself credit for." She looked up from the document. The look was brief and complicated, and he held it without looking away. "Don't be generous," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm accurate. You walked down to my office on a Thursday afternoon when you had 12 other things to do. You called me about a compliance memo at 6:15 in the evening and asked about my daughter. Those aren't the actions of someone who's still choosing to leave rooms empty." He paused. "Those are the actions of someone who's decided to come back." The silence that followed was the longest he'd experienced in one of their sessions. Not uncomfortable. Weighted. The kind of silence that exists between two people when something true has been said, and both of them know it, and neither of them quite knows what comes immediately after the truth. Clara looked at the table, then at her hands, then at him, and this time the look didn't have the careful calibration he'd come to expect. It was direct and unguarded in a way that he recognized as costing her something. "Daniel," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Not Mr. Brooks, not the professional distance of surname. His name, spoken with the same precision she gave everything, but carrying a weight that precision alone couldn't explain. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "The way I run this company, the decisions I make, the standards I hold, none of that changes. I want to be clear about that. I've spent too long building something that works to compromise it for—" She stopped, recalibrated. "For anything that isn't equally serious." He heard the shape of what she wasn't quite saying. "I know," he said. "I don't do things halfway," she continued. "I don't start things I'm not willing to finish, and I don't say things I don't mean. So when I tell you—" Another stop. He had the sense of watching someone dismantle a wall they'd built so long ago they'd forgotten the door was behind it. "When I tell you that I think about the people in my building differently than I did a year ago, that I think about you differently, I need you to understand that I'm not saying it lightly." "I know you're not," he said. "You don't do anything lightly." Something moved across her face. "No," she said. "I don't." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at her with the directness he'd learned, somewhere in the past months, that she required and respected. "Can I tell you something back?" She nodded once. "When Sarah died," he said, "I made a decision. Not a conscious one, not the kind you announce, but the kind you make at 3 in the morning when you're standing in a hospital parking lot, and everything has just changed permanently, and you need a rule to organize your life around. The rule I made was, the only thing that matters is Lily. Everything else, my own needs, the idea of anything for myself, that goes in a drawer. You get it back later, when things are different." He paused. "I've had that drawer closed for 3 years, and I think," he chose the next words carefully, "I think you're the first person who made me consider that later might actually come." Clara was very still. The kind of still that wasn't passive, but active. The stillness of someone giving something the full weight of their attention, because it deserves it. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "I don't say significant things lightly either." The moment between them settled into something that neither of them moved to break immediately. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, the building went about its morning. People walking past, phones ringing at distant desks, the hum of a company in motion. None of it touched the particular stillness inside that room, the quality of two people who have spent months circling the edge of something and have finally, simultaneously, stopped pretending they aren't. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I think we need a boundary." He didn't flinch. "Tell me what it is." "This." She gestured between them with a small, precise movement. "Whatever this is becoming, it can't compromise the work. It can't create a dynamic in this company that I've spent 20 years making sure doesn't exist here. If it becomes something, it has to be something we're both honest about. To HR, to the board, to ourselves first." She met his eyes. "I don't want to be careful with you, but I need to be correct." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think being correct and being careful don't have to be the same thing." She looked at him. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose they don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Lily's birthday is in June. You mentioned, I don't know if you remember, but you mentioned she'd be formidable." "I remember," Clara said. "She's decided on the dog," he said, "against my considerable resistance. She has revised her PowerPoint presentation 3 times. The latest version includes a cost-benefit analysis." Clara's mouth moved. This time, it made it further than halfway. She did a cost-benefit analysis. With real numbers. She looked up the average annual cost of dog ownership. She found a counter-argument for every objection I've raised. He shook his head. "I'm going to get a dog, Clara. I was never going to win this." And there it was, her name, spoken by him for the first time, slipping out the same way hers had slipped out with him. Naturally, and without ceremony, as though it had always been the word they were working toward. He watched her register it, watched the small, specific thing that happened to her face when she heard it. Not surprise, but arrival. The particular expression of someone who has been traveling toward a place for a long time and has just recognized the landscape. "You should let her win," Clara said quietly. "She earned it." She really did. He gathered his papers slowly. "I don't suppose you'd want to—" He stopped himself. "Say it," Clara said. He looked up. "Her birthday's a Saturday. We're doing something small. Just family, Mrs. Patterson, maybe a few of Lily's friends. Nothing formal." He held her gaze. "I don't suppose you'd want to come." The silence lasted long enough that he began constructing the graceful acceptance of a no. "That's very outside the boundary I just described," Clara said. You said the boundary was about honesty. I'm being honest. He paused. I'm also asking you something that has nothing to do with the 34th floor. She looked at him with an expression he didn't yet have a full vocabulary for. Complex and guarded, and underneath both of those things, unmistakably, something open. Something that had been locked up for a long time and was testing the door. A child's birthday party, she said. There will be a dog, presumably, and a 7-year-old who will absolutely try to show you her PowerPoint. A full second. Then Clara Vaughn said, I'll think about it. He smiled. Not the small, controlled kind. The real one. The one that came from somewhere low and unguarded. That's more than I expected. Don't get ahead of yourself, Brooks. But she said it differently than she'd said his name in that boardroom months ago. Differently than she'd said anything in the months before, if he was being honest. There was something in it that was almost warm. Almost. And getting closer. He stood, collected his folder, and moved toward the door. He stopped in the doorway, her doorway this time, and he felt the symmetry of it, the quiet echo of all the time she'd paused in his, and turned back. For the record, he said, I think you've been coming back to rooms for a while now. I just think you needed someone to notice. Clara looked at him from across the table, her posture perfect, her hands still, her face carrying that complicated open thing that he was learning to read the way you learn to read weather. Carefully, attentively, with the understanding that it tells you more than it seems to on the surface. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. He went back to his floor, sat down at his desk, looked at Lily's photo in the corner, and felt something settle in his chest. Not resolution exactly, not the clean ending of something difficult, but the particular feeling that comes when a thing you've been carrying alone for a long time becomes, almost imperceptibly, slightly less heavy. Lily called at 3:15 from the school office phone, which she only did when something was exciting enough to justify it. Daddy, she said without preamble, I want to name the dog Gerald. He put his head in his hand. We haven't agreed to a dog yet, Lily. Gerald is a strong name, she said. I looked it up. It means ruler with a spear. The dog doesn't need a name that means, I already told my class, she said. They all voted. Gerald won. He sat back in his chair. 28 floors below where Clara Vaughn was working, in the building they both occupied, in the life that was quietly becoming something neither of them had planned for. Daniel Brooks looked at the ceiling and laughed. The full, unguarded kind that you can't produce on purpose, that only arrives when something in the world exceeds what you'd prepared yourself to feel. Okay, he said. Gerald. She came. Daniel hadn't been certain she would. He'd told himself, in the 2 weeks between the invitation and the morning of Lily's birthday, that I'll think about it was not a yes, and that he should manage his expectations accordingly. He told himself this with the same reasonable, measured tone he used when coaching himself through other things he was quietly certain about. He was wrong about his certainty sometimes. He'd been wrong about Sarah, in the best possible way. Had told himself for 6 months after they met that she probably wasn't interested, that he was reading warmth as something more specific than it was, that people like her didn't tend to end up with people like him. And then one evening, she'd simply looked at him across a dinner table and said, You know I'm in love with you, right? You seem confused about it. And the whole careful structure of managed expectations had come apart in about 4 seconds. He thought about that sometimes. The way certainty arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet confirmation of something you'd already known and had been working very hard not to know. He was in the backyard with Lily at 10:15 when the front doorbell rang. Lily was explaining to Gerald, who had arrived Thursday, a 4-month-old golden retriever of moderate intelligence an absolute chaos energy, currently eating a paper plate, the rules of the birthday party, which she had apparently prepared in advance and was now delivering as a formal briefing. Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen. Rachel had flown in from Phoenix the night before and was currently sitting in a lawn chair drinking coffee and watching Lily's briefing with the expression of someone who found the whole situation deeply entertaining. Daniel went through the house to the front door. Clara was standing on the porch in a dark green dress he'd never seen, her hair down. He'd never seen that either. Always pulled back, always precise. And she had a wrapped gift under one arm and her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the door with the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is now standing inside it and discovering that the inside feels different from the outside. He opened the door. "You came," he said. "I said I'd think about it," she said. "I thought about it." He smiled. He stepped back to let her in, and she wheeled through the door and looked around the house with the attentive, unhurried quality she brought to every new space. Not assessing for value or status, just present, taking it in. The house was the house he'd bought with Sarah 7 years ago. It was not large. It had photographs on the walls, and a drawing Lily had made in kindergarten still on the refrigerator, and a dog crate in the kitchen corner that Gerald was currently ignoring in favor of the backyard. It was, in every visible way, the opposite of the glass and marble of the 34th floor. Clara looked at the drawing on the refrigerator as they passed through the kitchen. "Is that a cat?" she asked. "Lily insists it's a horse," Daniel said. "We've agreed not to revisit it." From the backyard came a shriek of pure joy, followed by the particular kind of chaos that indicated Gerald had escaped Lily's birthday party briefing and was now running laps. Rachel stood up. Mrs. Patterson leaned out the back door and said, "Daniel, I think the dog has someone's hot dog," with the calm of a woman who had seen many things. Clara looked toward the back door. Something in her posture changed. Not tensed, but alert. The way it changed when she was paying very close attention. "How many children are out there?" "5, plus Lily. 6 if you count Gerald, which Lily does." He held the back door. "Are you all right with—" "I'm fine," she said. And she said it with the particular firmness of someone who has been asked that question too many times in contexts that required them to perform capability. He noted the firmness and adjusted. "Then let's go," he said simply, and held the door wide. Lily saw her before Daniel had finished the introduction. Lily, who had been mid-chase of Gerald with a piece of birthday ribbon she was apparently trying to tie around his neck as a party decoration, stopped so completely that Gerald ran another full lap without her before realizing the game had paused. She looked at Clara with the unfiltered assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity as something more polite. "You're from Daddy's work," Lily said. "I am," Clara said. "You're the boss." "I am that too." Lily processed this. "Do you want to see my PowerPoint? It's about why Gerald was a necessary purchase." Daniel put his hand over his eyes. "I would very much like to see it," Clara said, and she said it with a straightness that was not condescension, but genuine. The seriousness with which she received things that deserved to be received seriously. Lily registered this immediately, the way children register when adults are actually talking to them versus performing interest. And she straightened up with the satisfaction of someone whose work has been recognized. "I'll get my tablet," Lily said, and ran inside, Gerald thundering after her. Rachel appeared at Daniel's elbow. She looked at Clara, then at Daniel, then back at Clara, with the expression of someone who had been told the broad outline of a story and was now seeing the actual thing and finding that it was considerably more than the outline had suggested. "Rachel Brooks," she said, extending her hand. "His sister. I flew in from Phoenix." "Clara Vaughn," Clara said, taking the handshake without hesitation. I know who you are. He mentions you. Rachel's eyebrows moved. Does he? Frequently, Clara said. He said you call twice a week, and you never pretend not to worry about him. A pause. He said it like it was one of the better things in his life. Rachel looked at Daniel with an expression he recognized. The "I told you so" that was too dignified to actually say itself out loud. He met it with the expression of someone who was refusing to give ground. I'm going to get drinks, he said. Does anyone need? I'm fine, both women said simultaneously. He went inside. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, listening to the sound of the backyard. Children, a dog, his sister's laugh cutting through the general noise. And underneath all of it, something that felt remarkably like a Saturday in June being exactly what a Saturday in June was supposed to be. He brought out the drinks. Clara was watching the kids with the same attentive quality she brought to the Monday morning sessions. Not passive observation, but active, engaged, like she was doing the mental work of understanding how things connected. Gerald had returned to the yard and was currently sitting in front of Clara's wheelchair with his head tilted at a 45-degree angle, examining her with the solemn intensity that golden retrievers sometimes produced in imitation of actual thought. He likes you, Daniel said, handing her a glass. He's deciding whether I'm a threat, Clara said. He does that with everyone. Smart dog. She looked at Gerald. After a moment, she reached down and let him sniff her hand. Gerald sniffed it once, declared it acceptable, and put his head in her lap with the immediate, unconditional intimacy that was either the best or worst thing about the breed, depending on your feelings about unconditional intimacy. Clara's hand, very slowly, moved to the top of his head. Daniel watched her face in that moment. The specific thing that happened to it when Gerald settled into her lap and she stopped holding herself at the precise, controlled distance she maintained from most things, and simply let her hand rest there, warm and unhurried. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Lily came back with the tablet and delivered the PowerPoint. It was 6 slides. It had a title page. Slide 3 was titled, as advertised, Why Daddy is Wrong, Revised. Clara sat through all 6 slides with complete attention, asked 2 clarifying questions about the cost projection on slide 4, and at the end said, Your methodology is sound. Your counter-argument section is particularly strong. Lily looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just been told something they already knew by the one person whose opinion they'd been waiting for. I know, Lily said. I told Daddy that. She did, Daniel confirmed. Lily looked at Clara the way she sometimes looked at Daniel when she was deciding whether to ask him something she wasn't sure about. It was a weighing look, measuring whether the person in front of her was someone who could handle the real question. Do you know my dad from work? She asked. Like, do you know him? The question hung in the warm June air. Clara looked at Lily with full, serious attention. Yes, she said. I know him. Is that okay with you? Lily thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Yeah, she said. He needs someone to talk to who isn't Mrs. Patterson or Aunt Rachel. No offense, she added in Mrs. Patterson's direction. None taken, Mrs. Patterson said serenely from her lawn chair. Daniel looked at his daughter, 7 years old today, wearing a birthday crown she'd made herself, covered in grass stains, completely correct about everything, and felt something in his chest pull tight and then release. Clara stayed for 4 hours. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. Not the arrival, which he'd half expected even while telling himself he hadn't, but the staying. Clara Vaughn, who left every room when the meeting was over, who did not linger, who had no history, as far as anyone in that building could observe, of choosing to be anywhere she hadn't specifically decided in advance to be, stayed for the entirety of Lily's birthday party. She ate a piece of birthday cake. She watched Lily blow out her candles. She let Gerald fall asleep across her feet while the kids played in the yard. And she sat with Rachel in lawn chairs and talked for 40 minutes about something Daniel couldn't hear from where he was managing the chaos of 6 children and a dog, but which made Rachel laugh 3 times, the real laugh, not the social one, and made Clara's face do the thing it had done in his office when she'd heard about the PowerPoint, that specific softening that was not performance, but recognition. The other children left at 4. Mrs. Patterson went home at 5, pressing Daniel's arm once on her way out, and not saying anything, because she was Mrs. Patterson, and she had 40 years of understanding exactly when words were unnecessary. Rachel helped clean up, and then sat at the kitchen table with her wine, and watched him rinse plates with the expression she'd been wearing all afternoon. "Say whatever you're going to say," he said. "She's remarkable," Rachel said. Not cautious, not hedged, just direct. "I know. There's something in her, something that's been through a lot, and built the whole structure of itself around not needing anything." Rachel turned her wine glass. "You know I say this because I love you. That kind requires patience." "I have patience," he said. "You have endurance," Rachel said. "Those are different things. Endurance is getting through it. Patience is choosing to stay in it. One's a survival skill. The other's a decision." She looked at him. "I want to make sure you know which one this is going to ask for." He put down the dish. He turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at his sister, who had flown in from Phoenix to be here, who called twice a week and never pretended not to worry about him, and who was, at this moment, asking him the most precise and important question anyone had asked him in 3 years. "I know," he said. "It's the second one, and I'm making the decision." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she raised her glass. "Okay," she said. "Then I'm happy for you." He was drying the last glass when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with Gerald, which was either a birthday miracle or a sign that 6-year-old party energy, followed by actual 8-year-old birthday exhaustion, had finally done what 3 days of persuasion hadn't: put them both out simultaneously. "She's asleep," Clara said. "Finally." "Gerald's her personal weighted blanket, apparently." He put down the glass. "Do you want more coffee before you—" "No." She looked at him steadily. "I want to say something before I go." He waited. "I don't do this," she said. "I need you to understand. I don't come to people's houses on Saturdays. I don't eat birthday cake. I don't let dogs sleep on me." She said it all factually, not defensively, the way she always said the real things, without softening them into palatability, because she trusted him to handle the actual content. "The last relationship I had ended 8 years ago because I didn't know how to be in a room with someone when the agenda was just being there. I've worked on that. I've worked on a lot of things. But I need you to know that this," she gestured, the same small, precise gesture she'd used in the conference room, "is not something I do casually." "I know," he said. "I also need you to know," she continued, and her voice was the same, flat and precise and carrying everything underneath the flatness, "that I have not stopped thinking about what you said. About the drawer. About later." She held his gaze. "I don't want to be later, Daniel. I want to be present. But I need to know that we're building something, not just standing in a room letting something happen to us." He crossed the kitchen to her, slowly, giving her time to recalibrate if she needed to, and crouched down so that he was at her eye level.
Not because she needed him to. She'd made that clear a dozen different ways. But because he wanted to look at her as an equal in a moment that deserved that. "Clara," he said, "I have been building toward this since the Monday morning in March, when I walked into your conference room on 4 hours of sleep and made the best mistake of my professional career." He said it quietly, without drama. "I'm not standing in a room letting something happen to me. I'm asking you, clearly and on purpose, if you want to build something with me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, in the living room, Gerald made the small sound he made in his sleep, which Lily had already named his dreaming noise. Clara looked at him with the expression he'd last seen in the conference room, complicated and open, and not at all distant. And for a moment, she was just a person, not the CEO, not the surgeon, not the architecture of everything she'd built around herself to make the years of alone manageable. Just a person sitting in a kitchen in June, deciding something that mattered. "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I've been a single father for 3 years. I don't know what easy is. I have a company to run. I have a board I answer to, and a reputation that doesn't accommodate—" "I know," he said. "We'll be correct about it. We agreed." "I'm also—" She stopped. The stop was the same as the one he'd heard the first day, in the boardroom, when she'd held her own position in her hands and examined it. I'm not naturally," she exhaled once. "There are whole parts of this I'll be learning." "So will I," he said. "That's what it is." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. He had, as it turned out, the patience Rachel had asked him about. Not the endurance kind, not the getting through it kind, but the choosing to stay kind, the kind that isn't passive but active, that holds space not because it has no other options, but because it has decided this particular space is worth holding. "Yes," Clara said. One word, given the same weight she gave everything important, without excess, without performance. Just the word, and the full meaning of it, offered directly. He stood. He offered his hand, not as a professional gesture, but as something more human than that. An anchor, a point of contact, the small physical act of two people deciding to be standing in the same place together. She took it. Her grip was firm and exact, and she held it for a moment before releasing. But the releasing was gradual rather than immediate, and that gradualness was its own entire sentence. "Stay for dinner," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I came to a birthday party, and now you want to feed me dinner." "Lily will want to show you Gerald's official bed setup when she wakes up. It has a monogrammed blanket. She spent her birthday money on it." Clara's expression moved again. He was keeping track now, cataloging every version of that expression. The small, real ones that arrived without announcement and lasted only a moment before she recalled them. They were his favorite thing. He intended to spend a considerable amount of time in the future arranging circumstances in which they appeared. "Monogrammed," she repeated. "She ordered it online. She used my credit card, which we're going to have to talk about." He moved toward the refrigerator. "I can do pasta. 30 minutes. A pause. "I can do 30 minutes, Clara said, and wheeled to the kitchen table and sat with the ease of someone who has decided that this kitchen, this table, this particular Saturday evening is somewhere she has chosen to be. He started the water. She was quiet in the way she was quiet in the Monday morning sessions. Not empty, but occupied, thinking through something with the full attention she gave things that mattered to her. "Daniel," she said after a moment. "Yeah?" "The company policy. The flexible scheduling." She looked at her hands on the table. "I want to tell you something about why I moved on it as fast as I did. Something I haven't said." He turned from the stove.
I had an employee 7 years ago. Brilliant woman. Operations analyst. One of the best I've worked with. She had a son with a chronic health issue. Nothing life-threatening, but demanding. She was managing it alone, the way you manage things alone, and she never said a word about it, because the culture of this company at the time it was my father's culture, and his culture did not reward vulnerability. Clara said it without inflection, but the flatness was working hard. She resigned 18 months in. I only found out about her son when I read her exit interview, which I should have read at the time, and didn't because I was 42 days into running a company that had been mismanaged for a decade, and I was operating in crisis mode. A pause. I thought about her when you walked into that meeting looking like you hadn't slept since February. He was quiet. I thought, I have made this building a place where people come to work and don't come to be human. And I was so focused on the emergency of the company that I told myself that was acceptable. And it isn't. She looked up. You didn't start the policy. You confirmed that the policy was already overdue. He crossed back to the table and sat down across from her. What was her name? He asked. The analyst. Patterson, Clara said, and then something altered very slightly on her face. Dolores Patterson. Daniel stared. Mrs. Patterson, he said. My neighbor. She's been next door since before we moved in. Since Sarah and I... He stopped. She worked for you. 34th floor, Clara said. Operations, 2018 to 2019. They looked at each other across the table. That's not a coincidence, Daniel said. That's not even close to a coincidence. No, Clara agreed. It isn't. He sat back. He thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had been there every sick day and school emergency and late-night deadline for 3 years, who had held the door open when Daniel could not hold it himself, who had never once mentioned Vaughn Capital Group. He thought about the specific texture of the world, arranging itself into patterns that you couldn't see until the angle was right. I need to talk to her, he said. You should, Clara said. She deserved better from me. She deserves to know I know that. She'll probably make you a casserole, Daniel said. That's how she processes significant emotional events. She shows up with a casserole. I've been told I could stand to accept more casseroles, Clara said, in a tone that was so precisely dry that it took him a full second to understand it was a joke. The first real joke he'd heard from her, delivered with a straight face and the smallest possible lift at the corner of her mouth. He laughed. The real kind. The unguarded kind. The kind that had been coming more frequently lately, loosened by the accumulated weight of months of someone slowly becoming real to him. Clara watched him laugh with the expression she'd had all day, complicated and open, and not pulling back from what it saw. Dinner, she said, nodding toward the stove. Right, he stood up. I'm serious about the work, she said to his back. When we're in the building, I know, he said. We're professional. We're correct. We disclose it properly. We handle it by the rules. We don't let it compromise either of us. He looked over his shoulder. I was married for 5 years to a woman I respected completely. I know what it looks like when you take someone seriously in every dimension of your life. Clara was quiet for a moment. Tell me about her sometime, she said. If you want to. Yeah, he said. I will. He cooked, the kitchen filled with the sound of it. Water, heat, the smell of garlic, the distant dreamy noises of a dog in the living room. Clara sat at the table, and they talked the way they'd been talking for months, except that the work scaffolding was gone now, and underneath it was the same quality of conversation, direct and unhurried and honest, the kind that goes somewhere real, because neither person is performing a version of themselves that's been optimized for safety. She told him about her father. Not everything, not the full weight of it, but the shape of it. A man who had built something significant and loved his daughter in the only way he knew how, which was by measuring her against it. She told him about MIT, about the years of making herself necessary and excellent and invulnerable. She told him about the accident, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a fact she'd carried for a long time and had gotten comfortable carrying, and was, cautiously, beginning to set down in places where it was safe to do so. He listened the way she listened, completely, without interrupting, giving it the full weight of his attention. He told her about Sarah. Not the death, not the hospital parking lot at 3 a.m. Not yet. That was its own conversation for another evening. But Sarah the person, the way she'd laughed, the way she'd looked at Daniel like she'd decided something and was at peace with the decision. The way Lily had her eyes and his stubbornness, and the specific, irreplaceable quality of being the best evidence of what Sarah had believed about the future. Clara listened to all of it, and when he finished, she said, "She chose well," in the quiet, factual tone of someone giving an honest assessment. "And so did you." Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:15, hair wild, birthday crown askew, Gerald attached to her left ankle by the specific grip of a dog who has decided this human is his. She looked at Clara at the table. She looked at her father at the stove. She looked at the table again, at the 2 glasses, and the food, and the quality of the room that children have no words for, but always recognize. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked Clara. "Yes," Clara said. Lily nodded, with the considered approval of someone whose opinion has been the deciding factor all along. "Good," she said. "Gerald likes you. He doesn't like everyone." "I noticed," Clara said. "That means you're okay," Lily said. She sat down at the table like she'd been sitting there all her life. "Can we have garlic bread?" "Already on it," Daniel said. They ate dinner, the 3 of them, at a kitchen table in a house that was small and lived in and covered in the evidence of a life that had been hard and was still full and was becoming, in ways that none of them had planned for, something new. The sun came down through the window and made long rectangles of gold across the floor. Gerald relocated from Lily's ankle to Clara's feet and went back to sleep, deeply and without apology. Lily talked about school and Gerald and her revised plan for the backyard, which apparently now involved a dedicated dog obstacle course that she had also sketched preliminary blueprints for. Clara listened and asked questions and ate garlic bread and looked, in the slant gold light of a Saturday evening, like someone who had carried a long and specific kind of alone for a very long time and had just, quietly and without ceremony, set it down. Daniel watched her. He watched her the way he'd been watching her for months, attentively, patiently, with the conviction of someone who understood the difference between waiting for something and choosing it. What he felt, sitting at that table, was not the breathless turbulence of a beginning, but something steadier and deeper than that. The particular piece of a man who has been lost and has found, not the direction he started from, but the direction he was always meant to go. Lily fell asleep again at 9, the second time, exhaustion finally winning the argument. This time in her bed, with Gerald curled at the foot of it like a small golden anchor. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his daughter, who would be 8 years old until she was 9, who had made a cost-benefit analysis at age 7, and won every argument she'd entered, and named her dog Gerald, and given her birthday party briefing to a CEO with the confidence of someone who had always known her own worth. He turned off the light and went back to the kitchen. Clara was still at the table. She hadn't checked her phone. She hadn't reached for her tablet. She was sitting in the quiet of a house where a child was asleep and a dog was dreaming, and the evening had settled into the particular stillness that follows a full and genuine day, and she was simply there, present, in the room, in the house, in the life, as though she had decided it was somewhere worth being and had not moved because she hadn't finished being there yet. He sat down across from her. "She's extraordinary," Clara said, without preamble. "Yeah," he said, "she is. She's going to run something someday." Clara said it with the certainty she gave to things she'd fully assessed. "Something important." "I know." He looked at the empty doorway. "It terrifies me and makes me proud in equal measure." "That's what it should do." Clara looked at him. "That's what it means to have raised someone who will not need saving." He held that, turned it over, let it be exactly what it was. He looked at Clara Vaughn, at the woman who had built a company out of precision and solitude, who had spent a decade using efficiency as a reason to avoid rooms and had come to a birthday party on a Saturday in June and stayed for dinner and let a dog sleep on her feet and had said yes with all the weight of someone who does not say things lightly. The woman who had steadied a sleeping stranger in a boardroom and then quietly, without announcement, rebuilt a policy and a perspective and something in herself that had needed rebuilding for a long time. "I'm glad you came today," he said. "So am I," she said. Simply, completely. Outside, the city went on being what cities were, lit and moving and loud, full of people carrying their separate weights through their separate lives. But in this kitchen, in this house, in this particular and unrepeatable Saturday in June, two people who had each been holding the door shut against something they needed sat across a table in the quiet aftermath of a child's birthday party and let the door be open. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them needed to. What was coming was already there, patient and certain and real, the way the only true things are. Not dramatic, not sudden, but inevitable, in the manner of things that have been growing toward the light for a long time and have finally, simply, arrived. Gerald made his dreaming noise down the hall. The clock on the wall moved through the stillness of 9:15 on a Saturday in June. And Daniel Brooks, who had walked into a boardroom on 4 hours of sleep in 3 days and accidentally changed the direction of everything, looked at Clara Vaughn and understood, fully, without reservation, without the managed expectations he'd been carefully maintaining for months, that this was not the beginning of a story. This was where the story had been going all along.